Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. Part of the reason I love hosting this show is that I get to push myself out of my reading comfort zone and take on some genres and authors that I would not normally gravitate towards. The rewards are very rich. Today, I do just that with writer Casey McQuiston. I haven't historically read romance novels. I actually generally don't really like it when novels have a happy ending. It just doesn't feel true to life to me. But what I do love is a novel with strong character development, and romance novels certainly do have character. I was drawn in by the descriptions I read of the two leads in Casey McQuiston's new novel, The Pairing. Kit and Theo are childhood best friends who are now in their late 20s. They started dating as teenagers, but they broke up in a disastrous manner that keeps them from speaking to one another for 4 years. This is my personal nightmare. It's one of the worst things I could imagine happening to me. Kit and Theo then unexpectedly find themselves on the same food and wine tour of Europe, the trip that they had planned to take together as a couple 4 years prior. And that's where we meet them in The Pairing. When Casey wrote their first romance novel, Red, White, and Royal Blue, all the way back in 2016, they didn't expect it to become a blockbuster success. But the book took off on social media, and Red, White, and Royal Blue skyrocketed to the top of bestseller lists. Then it became a movie, and Casey became the face of queer romance writing in North America. They followed up Red, White, and Royal Blue with the sapphic romance One Last Stop and the YA novel I Kissed Shara Wheeler. Casey is originally from Louisiana, and they now live in New York. They joined me in the studio in Toronto. Hi, Casey. How are you?
Hi, I am so great. How are you?
I am so good, and I'm so glad it's a treat always anytime I get to have someone in studio. It's not an everyday occasion for me, so this is fantastic.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here, and this is my very first time, not only in Toronto, but in Canada, period. So
huge. Yeah. No, this is a big milestone, I think, for both of us.
Yeah.
So part of why I wanted to talk to you is because I feel like in superficial ways, at least, I think there's a lot that we have in common. I know we both kind of became public figures in a way that was quite sudden and unexpected. We're expected perhaps to speak on queer issues or be a representative of a community in a way that perhaps, at least for me, was difficult to navigate. I don't want to speak for you. We both have experiences losing a parent in our 20s. There's just all of these things. I could do a big laundry list. But what I found so interesting about this is that I am not normally a reader of romance novels. I normally avoid the genre entirely. You obviously have made your name in your career writing romance novels. Meanwhile, I'm here I don't even know what I have to say about this. What is it about romance and stories with happy endings, sort of the story that makes people feel happy to read, that appeals to you?
I mean, it's funny because I don't know if I would describe myself as someone who's typically drawn to reading that sort of thing all the time. Mm-hmm. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy. I love a thriller. I love a book that makes me miserable. I love anguish and pain sometimes. But when it comes to what I'm drawn to creating and what I've always felt drawn to in whatever genre of fiction I've read or watched, I think relationships and love stories. I think there's something about the satisfaction of the connection between two people being consummated or being completed in this really poetic and symmetrical and satisfying way that really just scratches something. It scratches something in my brain. It makes me very happy. And I think also what you might be referring to is I think that my books are described often as being about joy and queer joy and escapism. And I wonder all the time what it is about me that I keep coming back to that as a writer. And I think it might just be because I am an extremely anxious person who needs the safety net of a happy ending in order to drop myself down the well of writing something and sometimes even reading something. And the way that you're able to explore so many different themes and feel safe as a writer and as a reader, knowing that there's some kind of resolution at the end where things will be tied up in a satisfying way, which is something that life does not often afford us. as someone who's extremely anxious, that's very attractive.
Yeah. I mean, there've definitely been times where I've been reading books and I do seek out often material that doesn't have that kind of satisfying, neat ending where then I find myself upset. I'm like, but what is going to happen to these people at the end of this book? What's going to happen at the end of this film? I am also somebody who I think could fairly be described as a high anxiety person, but I think I sort of seek out the bad vibes books, I would say. I remember one time doing an interview where someone was asking me like what I'd been reading lately to relax. And I was like, The Trial by Franz Kafka.
So relaxing.
Such a relaxing. I was like, but this is real life. Like, this is how it is. And so I think it's interesting. People just kind of have different ways of coping with being an anxious person, with dealing with perhaps difficult events in their own life. I mentioned sort of the shared experience of losing a parent because I know you've spoken in press before that you started writing romance shortly after your father passed away, that you'd always wanted to be a writer, but that you got into this in 2015 in that sort of initial grieving period.
Yeah.
My dad died about a year and a half ago, and I found myself during that period of time avoiding anything that was happy ending, good vibes, because it just felt so discordant with how I was feeling.
Completely.
I was reading a lot of grief memoirs. I was reading a lot of very grim material. So totally the opposite, it seems, of what you did. What do you think it was about that specific moment in your life that made you want to take the plunge into actually writing?
Oh, first I have to say that there's like a flip side to me becoming a rom-com writer after my dad died, which is I've also become a huge horror fan since my dad died. And I think that's like the duality of man, isn't it? Sometimes I seek out the most like frothy escapist fiction or the most frothy escapist fantasies in my own mind. And sometimes I want to watch a relentless, horrible, like sensory experience that is going to take me all the way into like all of the somatic feelings of being traumatized and then like release me at the end into my own home. And I think those things are very actually tied together. But I think that I lost my dad in 2014 to a very aggressive brain cancer. And that whole experience was when you lose a loved one to brain cancer, it's like it's not a clean death. It's it's a very like traumatic deterioration period for everyone involved. And I think emerging from like the fog of that, it being such a complicated loss and such a complicated grief, I kind of came out the other side a raw chicken, just like, what do I do with myself in any way? Shortly after that, then I had like a really rough breakup, and then I had like started a new job, and I was just kind of like having this crisis of like, who even am I? What am I doing? And I started just kind of throwing stuff at the wall. I had kind of somewhat given up on being a novelist for a while because I saw it as like a very impractical career choice. And I was really scared of chasing it. And then like all of the worst things that could happen happened. And it was the same period of time when I got really into soap making for a while, cake decorating, textile art. I was like really just seeing what would stick. And at the same time, around that time, I read The Royal We by Heather Morgan and Jessica Cox. And it really reminded me, like it had been a minute since I had read a contemporary romance, and it reminded me how much I love them. And it made me feel really happy. And I was like, wow, haven't felt like an unqualified happiness in a minute. Wouldn't it be cool if I could create that environment for myself in my brain? And so I sat down and was like, okay, I need to come up with an idea. And I had like royal romance on the brain. And then I also had like, it was like the 2016 election. So I had like politics on the brain. And that kind of like sparked into this idea of this like clandestine romance between the royal family and the first family. And I just like, it was this moment where I had the idea and I was like, oh, I could take this and run with it. And so I like spent a lot of hours at my desk job just like like in my Google Docs working on this book just to see if I could, honestly, just to see if this was the thing that I was supposed to be doing that was going to get me out of the hole of like emotional crap. And it kind of was.
That makes a lot of sense when you put it that way. I want to talk a bit about the release of Red, White, and Royal Blue, because as you said, it was the run up to the 2016 election. Politics obviously was on your mind at the time. we're now in 2024. There's another election on the horizon. One of the guys involved is the same. So much has changed, it feels, in the past 8 years politically, but also some things haven't changed.
Yeah.
How has your approach to writing and choice of subject matter changed over those past 8 years, either as a result of societal changes or your meteoric career rise as well?
Oh, meteoric.
It's meteoric. I think that's fair to say.
Okay. All right. I picture it more as like a I don't know, like a Roman candle.
Yeah.
No, I think so much has changed for me. People talk about wish fulfillment in Red, White, and Royal Blue from like usually just like strictly a political point of view. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest wish fulfillment element of Red, White, and Royal Blue for me is the fact that when I was first drafting it, I hadn't come out to my family yet. And everywhere in my life and every sphere of my life, I was out except with my family. And I think a big part of the wish fulfillment of that book is like me elevating the stakes of the story to what felt like the stakes of my own life, where it was like, what if I came out and it was actually so great that everyone like threw a parade and made T-shirts and were so supportive of me, and it wasn't the end of the world. I was still living in my hometown in Louisiana at the time and feeling just so isolated from like a robust queer community, and feeling there was so much I was still sorting through from like how I grew up. So I think like a big part of what I was trying to create for myself with Red, White, and Royal Blue was like all of the things I wasn't getting from my physical life, the validation, the support, the community, the celebration of my own queerness that I feel like I hadn't really been able to fully let myself have yet. Mm-hmm. And fast forward to like many years later, many book tours later, many times of like being in rooms of like hundreds of people who are in community in queerness and transness around my books. The way that has healed me, the way that has like given me this sort of do-over queer adolescence, has changed me a lot. I think also like having the stability in my life now. When I wrote One Last Stop, I had no health insurance at the time. I'd like quit my day job to like do books, which was like not a choice I recommend to everyone. I was like living in a rent house with some friends in Colorado and like applying to MC bar trivia, to make some money.
Not bar trivia.
Yeah, actually, I think I'd be really good at it.
I could see you as a bar trivia MC, actually.
Yeah, but I think like that's a big part of why so much of One Last Stop feels like it's about like kind of like kicking in the water and like reaching for things. It's like I was like, oh, this is gonna work out. And I think now I have like the privilege of being able to write from this place of comfort and security. And so the ideas I'm interested in exploring now are a little different, and that's why I feel like The Pairing is such an indulgent book, because I now have the luxury of being able to indulge a bit more. I think I've worked through a lot of my own internalized stuff and my like shame and my intense feelings of like feeling weird about writing about sex because I grew up in purity culture. A lot of those things I think have changed my perspective a lot. And I think I've also like really come into my own as a non-binary person and as someone who, experiences a lot of different kinds of love and is able to write about it a bit more confidently. I think I'm very much a different person than I was when I sat down to write the first draft of Red, White, and Royal Blue, which is why I think sometimes, as much as I have so much love and gratitude for that book, at the same time, sometimes it feels like it was written by a past self. So much of what I reach for now for wish fulfillment is not about like big, loud moments, but it's about these quiet moments of peace.
Yeah, I think there's so much in what you're saying where I'm like nodding. I'm like, You grew up Catholic, right? And went to an evangelical school?
Yes. Yeah. I was like, would you like to get both flavors of Christian guilt and shame at once?
Yeah. No, I am from a Catholic family, but went to Catholic high school as well, because I'm not from a place where the evangelical church is like really a factor at all. I'm sure it exists, but it's certainly not like the predominant flavor of Christianity.
Yeah.
And so I at least only kind of have one variety of that sort of stuff to work through.
Yeah.
But so much of what you're saying of kind of wanting so badly this sort of celebration really resonates, I think, with my experience. But I didn't even like think it was reasonable to want, which is, I think, perhaps why you turned to romance. You were like, I do want this. And I was like, I don't even think I wanted at all because it's so unfathomable.
Wait, can I speak on that for a second?
Please, go.
Because I had this experience a lot in my like early mid-20s when I would talk to friends from blue states about Pride who were really over it. They were like, Pride is cringe. Why are you going to Pride? And I'm like, you don't understand that I have to like drive 4 hours to get to Pride. I would go to Houston Pride every year.
Right.
And I would drive there from Louisiana, and it was like, it was partially because it was the biggest Pride I could get to, but also because it was a Pride where no one would recognize me.
Right. It was far enough away that it felt safe.
Yeah. And when I talked about like the do-over adolescence, there's a certain level of catching up that you have to do as a queer adult who's raised in like a really conservative environment where you kind of have to become okay with yourself and then do all of the things that come with being like a queer coming of age moment. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, the joy felt really rebellious and the joy feels really defiant. And I think it's mellowed a bit in my 30s, but the joy does still feel a bit defiant.
Yeah, I think my turn away from joy, it's like it didn't even occur to me that was like something I needed to work through until quite recently. And so I think this book, and I want to get to talking about the pairing, like came to me at such a good time for me to be maybe more open to engaging with this kind of queer joy. This was the first of your work that I actually read. I did not read Red, White, and Royal Blue. I like heard all about it from friends of mine who had read it and watched the film adaptation. But the first encounter that I had with your writing was through this new novel. So the pairing is about two lifelong friends, and they've known each other since elementary school. And they've been through a lot of stuff together in terms of big life changes, moving, going to college, the death of one of their parents. Why did you want to explore this kind of long-running and complex relationship? Because I feel like a lot of romance is like the meet cute, and it's starting from nothing, and it's this rapid escalation. We're meeting people that have a lot of history together already in the pairing.
I mean, I think partially it is what you just described. It's something I hadn't done before and I hadn't read a lot of. That's always an enticing challenge to me. But I also think it's really tough to get people to root for an ex's romance. It requires a lot of tightrope walking because you have to come up with a reason for the breakup that it's like big enough that it was justified for them to break up, but not so big they can't come back from it. And no one's really the bad guy, and you can still like root for both of them and root for them to get back together. And you have to work through all that and also believe that they were meant for each other the whole time. And I think building into that this lifelong connection, to me, it felt like it added all of the meat to the bones of that. You know, I have had a few different relationships in my life that were like lifelong friendships that ended for one way or another that were like as painful, if not more painful, than some romantic relationships that I've had that ended. And I think also sometimes it can make a character a bit less likable if they're still pining after someone they dated for 2 years. Like 4 years later, you're like, that's kind of embarrassing for you.
That's kind of cringe.
Like, yeah, it's kind of cringe. Maybe like, I don't know, move on. But if it was this person who was your person for so long, of course there's that void that you can't really move on from.
Yeah.
I was really intrigued by that connection, and I felt like there was so much to work with in there.
Yeah, I think that was the first thing that sort of sold me on, okay, this is a book that I do want to read, because I think a great fear that I have had in the past about romantic relationships is like when it ends, I'm like so desperate to remain friends with the person because I'm a Scorpio with a Scorpio Venus.
For those listening at home, you are wearing Scorpio earrings right now.
Yes, I'm wearing Scorpio earrings right now. I famously have the scorpion tattoo on my arm. Like, it's very, and the reason I do all this is because I really do identify with it. And I think that there's this sort of deep commitment and loyalty that I frame as a positive Scorpio trait, which means that once you have decided that someone is so important to you that you want to date them, like, you don't want that person to ever be out of your life.
Yes.
And so the idea of this rupture of two people that, as you said, it's like they've found their person.
Yeah.
And then they don't talk for years is like basically, in my mind, my worst nightmare. It's like the worst thing that could ever happen to me.
Yes. Well, and then imagine if it was the person that it was like your lifelong best friend, but then also you went through a period of thinking you were in unrequited love for them, and then you finally got them. And then they left your life as a romantic partner and a friend, and you didn't see them or speak to them for 4 years. The way that would wreck you, the way that I knew it would wreck me, and the way that I imagined myself spelunking down into those feelings, I couldn't resist.
Yeah. Another thing that I found so appealing about it is there's so many references in this book. There's a specificity in details. You can tell that it's been super deeply researched. The pairing is this food tour, essentially, of France and Italy and Spain. And so I was loving reading these details of the pinchos that they're eating in San Sebastian. I just was in Barcelona in June, and I went to like a Basque bar while I was there. And I was like, I've had some of these. This is great. I feel like I'm back there. What was the process of research like preparing for this book? Because I'm not like a food and beverage expert, but to the extent that I know about food and beverage, this feels very real to me. I can smell the smells. I can taste the flavors.
Yeah. I mean, I love food so much. I love ingredients. I love smells and flavors. I love describing them. And so when I decided I wanted to do a food and wine tour, it was partially because I knew it was going to be so fun for me to write and it was going to be really fun to research. And then to do the research, my starting point was I was like, well, I mean, unfortunately, I do have to go to Europe and I do have to go on a food tour.
Oh, how hard that must have been.
I know. It's a really tough job. But so I just like rolled it all into like a 3.5-week trip where I went to Paris, Barcelona, Florence, and Rome. And in between, I spent some time, I did like a day tour in parts of Tuscany. So like a lot of the tours, the chocolate crawl and like the tapas crawl in Barcelona in the book and the pastry tour in Paris, those were things I did. And I tried to ask as many possible questions when I was on every tour and to take notes of every insignificant detail. And anytime I had the option, I would get a local to guide me. Mm-hmm. So I booked a lot of like Airbnb experiences with random locals just walking you through a city.
Yeah.
Highly recommend.
I have done, I guess, what I would say have been inadvertent like dad grief vacations to Europe over the past 2 years. Yeah. I went on this trip to Portugal like a month after my dad died, which was like, I had booked it before. It is bananas that I still went. And I was with a big group of gay men. So it was like I didn't have to do any of the organizing really. So that was great. But it was like so boisterous and crazy. Yeah. But one of them was Portuguese. And so what you're saying about kind of getting the local experience, we went to his family's backyard in this tiny town and had like leitão, like roast suckling pig. And we were getting that kind of really in-depth experience that you can only get if you know somebody who knows the region well. Like I felt, even though I hadn't been to a lot of the places that were being described in the book, I was like, okay, this is like what I was doing in Portugal. This is like my pinchos that I was eating in Barcelona was on my dad's birthday. So I had this big grief experience. And then I went to Sagrada. I was like doing all of this stuff that the characters are doing in the book.
Oh my God. I feel like I have to apologize to you for putting the parental grief trap in there as well.
No, but that's but I've said earlier, I'm always like, okay, like let me go seek it out. And so much of actually, my dad used to work in kitchens, and so much of how he expressed his love for people was through making food. And that's something that I now am trying to kind of recapture. And that's like a big feature of what's going on in, I think for Kit in this book as well, is like his connection with his mom. I think he's like manifesting. She was an artist. His art is pastry. He seems to really like connect with the people he loves through that.
Very much that. I don't know if you find this to be true, but I do think that often when we lose a parent, we start to become the parent we lost a little bit in intentional and unintentional ways. I've become so much more like my dad since he's been gone.
I definitely was like my dad a lot already, but I think there's times where I find myself saying things where I'm like, I live with one of my younger brothers, and one thing that my dad used to always do if I was being a lazy teenager at home, if I got up after noon, he would always make a big show of saying, "Good afternoon, like nice to see you." And I do that to my younger brother all the time. Oh and my God. He hates it.
Yeah, my dad used to do this thing. I would be like, I'm going to go take a shower. He'd be like, "Oh, it smells like a good idea." And I say that all the time now.
These are jokes that are important to keep alive, you know? I think sometimes the dad humor is really important. I think that it sometimes is important for lesbians, non-binary children of dads to really maintain these traditions. So you know, it falls to us to keep it alive.
So true.
I mentioned there's like the specificity of details about the food in the book. There's also a ton of references to movies, to works of literature, to works of art. I can see for the listening audience, I'm sitting across from Casey. They have a tattoo of the birth of Venus, which is something that shows up in the book. There's stuff about Keanu Reeves' action movies, but also Wong Kar-wai, like the low and high brow. Why did you want to include these rich and varied references and interests? because I loved it and found it just like so evocative and representative of how I talk with my friends. But it's not something you always see as a method of character development.
I think that it's really hard sometimes to put into a book, especially like a contemporary romance, and not feel like to not have it read as if you are posturing for the reader to be like, see, I know things. See, I'm cool. I've been to parties before, you know, but it is also very authentic. I feel like it'd be very inauthentic to write these two late 20s queer people who are best friends hanging out and like not talking about movies and music and things that they love, because that's 90% of what I talk about with my friends. Choosing those references really carefully is a big part of it. This is a split POV book, and it's the first time I've ever written split POV, and like Theo's references are sort of more lowbrow and in a very intentional way, and Kit's are more highbrow. And it was fun to do that juxtaposition. And part of it is like when you're trying to establish two different voices for two different characters who are both going to be speaking in first person, I never, ever wanted it to feel like their voices were interchangeable.
Yeah.
And I wanted them to feel really distinct from each other. And part of that was like through references and through the way that they use their references to relate to the world around them. Theo comes from this film family and very sort of rebelliously against their like auteur film family is really into B movies from the 80s. And so I wanted that to be part of their voice. It's not just the words that are chosen, but the references that are chosen. So like they're going to look at the beautiful set of stairs at Sacré-Cœur in Paris and think like, oh yes, this is where they shot that climactic scene in John Wick 4, you know. And Kit is going to be doing art theory analysis in his mind.
One thing that was really fun also seeing these characters that had these two different sets of reference points was also the ways in which through their relationship they start to sort of absorb and osmose things from the other person. Theo is not somebody who has this art education background and is more into the lowbrow stuff, but finds themselves accidentally knowing things about Bernini just through Kit. And that's like absolutely, I think, a way that my relationships that are close like have also gone. Like, you know, this is how it really works. So it was so cool to see this in the book.
I think it's also can be a way of expressing like love and care is like speaking to someone in their frame of reference or taking an interest in the things that they like. Like there's a moment where Kit kind of expresses himself in a vulnerable moment by referencing the movie Face Off.
Yeah.
Starring Nick Cage and John Travolta. And Theo is delighted and moved by this gesture from him because he's speaking to them in their language. And I think that is something that's worthwhile as well.
I'm Mattea Roach, and you're listening to Bookends. Today, I'm speaking with American romance writer Casey McQuiston. Casey, there's like a lot of discussion about representation and diversity in romance writing now, but I know that the sort of political conditions, as we mentioned before, have changed a lot since you started your writing career. I want to talk a little bit about that, I guess. I hate to be the person who's asking the question, why do you think representation matters? But it is important to talk about. So why do you think representing different kinds of characters in romance is important, and what drives you to tell these kinds of stories?
Oh, I mean, I think that here's the thing is that there's often a moment I have when I'm reading where I see something that like electrifies me because I'm like, oh, I didn't know this was allowed. Like I didn't know, like the first time I ever read a romance novel, I was like, I didn't know that sex was allowed in books, you know, because sex was something that was so demonized and hidden away in like the culture I grew up in. And so I think a lot about like those moments of revelation where you're like, oh, something that I thought I had to be ashamed of, or something that I have a complicated relationship with, or something that makes me feel alienated from other people is something that is published here in this book. And there's like a level of comfort in being legitimized that way. And you see that and you're like, oh, this is allowed to exist. Like this is not something that I have to hide away. And I feel like for me, from my experience, a lot of my early relationship with like queerness and transness was concealment. And so representation to me means that I'm able to begin dismantling the little shelter built around my truest self. But I think also there's something to be said too about writing representation for the people it's about rather than like of the people it's about. I feel like my books, especially like the farther I get into my career, the more I feel like this is true. My books are really written for people who can relate to the experiences in them. And I'm not really concerned as much with like teachable moments or like I feel like when you put queer sex and pleasure into the same room, so many people get scared. And it's like, no, queerness is only allowed if it's about how it
suffering.
If it's about how it will make you suffer, or in like more recent years, like if it's about teaching us about how we all are valid and like, and that's like a really noble goal to have in mind with a book, but it is not something I'm really interested in as a writer. And so where I come to representation from often is a place of like, well, sometimes what's important is having a good time and being horny, and like sometimes that is resistance too, you know? And I feel like that is really my thesis statement as a writer these days.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's interesting you mentioned like you're writing these books for the community that the characters are a part of, writing kind of to an audience of queer and trans people. And I definitely agree. Like the pairing didn't feel like it was about gender and sexuality, even though obviously that's such a huge feature of these characters' lives. And one thing that was interesting to me is we have a character, Theo, who is non-binary, but this is revealed like partway through the book. And Theo is assigned female at birth, like previously is using she, her pronouns, and then has this coming out moment talking to Kid of saying, yeah, actually in the 4 years that we haven't been speaking, I've come to this realization about myself and my own gender. I mentioned before we were on air, I was like, there was one moment in the book that felt very didactic to me. And it was the conversation between Theo and Kit, where Theo's explaining how kind of they feel the role of a woman like doesn't really fit them. And they feel a lot better when people refer to them using gender neutral pronouns. But it's not a conversation that they want to have with every person all the time. And so sometimes she, her is okay. I think the reason why it really needled me was because I, like you, started using gender neutral pronouns after becoming a public figure. And so this is a conversation that I've had to have like pretty explicitly with a lot of people. And I think it was the only time in the book where like it annoyed me that a conversation went really well. Because I was like, ironically, my professional experience of saying, hey, please use they, them pronouns, all super, super positive, really good. Some of the personal conversations, I just like didn't want to have it that way.
No.
So I guess I'm wondering, first off, why was this plot line like important for you to include? And then second of all, what made you want to kind of deal with it this way? Because I'm wondering whether there was some sort of way in which your personal experience informed the portrayal that made its way into the book.
Yeah. I mean, when I first came up with the concept of this book, I had 2 bisexual exes and I had no further information about the 2 characters in that. And it was kind of just like, choose your own adventure on a gender level. And it was pretty early that I knew I wanted to do this story that was exploring the way that like bisexuality and gender fluidity kind of interact and the way that could be expressed in a relationship, because I think that's a really cool and unique form of intimacy. There's a lot of Kit ruminating on his attraction to Theo and how being attracted to many different genders allows him to fully appreciate the expansiveness of Theo's gender. And I knew I really wanted to dig into that because I think it's really cool. It's something that I experienced in my own relationship with my partner and that I think is interesting. And I wanted to write about it. But I think my gender timeline is basically that I had my sort of like epiphany about it in like 2017 probably. And then like with being queer, it was like this gradual coming out where like first I wanted to be out to my friends. And then like what I didn't have the luxury of anymore was like coming out at work does not just mean coming out in one sphere anymore. It means coming out in all the spheres.
Yeah.
There's one sphere now. And so I knew that I could not be using they, them pronouns at work until I was ready to have that conversation with my family.
Right.
And ironically, I was outed to one of my sisters by my own Wikipedia page.
That's so funny,
you know?
Because this actually, I did the work stuff first. And my dad, I remember one time texted me and he was like, I noticed on this podcast that they were talking about you using they, them pronouns. Like, what's that about? And I literally said it was a business decision. And then we never talked about it again. And I guess we never will. So there we go.
Wow. Yeah. Whew. I mean, first of all, it's a business decision is hilarious.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's tough because I think you can probably relate to this from like speaking about queer topics, but you want people to understand the perspective that you're writing from, especially with my first book being about two dudes. I got a lot of pushback from people being like, who is this straight woman writing about these two men, which like 0 for 2 on that one, my man. But truly, I did want to be able to like be clear about the point of view I was writing from because I feel like when I write about men, I'm usually doing it in like a pretty transmasculine way. And I wanted to be able to be open about it, but I didn't want to have the conversations with people close to me in my life. It's so much easier to come out to strangers than
Totally.
it is to, and like I think that's what you're getting at there is like sending an email to my pub team about changing my pronouns in my bio is so much easier than having to have a vulnerable conversation with a close friend or a family member. And I think that was like a huge part of why I held back on Theo coming out to Kit for so long in the book. Whereas like I knew the whole reason for the split POV was so I could have Theo first introduced from their own point of view. We could meet them where they are at 4 years later. And then once it kind of became a conversation they had to have, they could no longer avoid with Kit, and that Kit had re-earned their trust, then they would have that conversation with him. But writing that conversation was really hard because honestly, ultimately, if I wrote that conversation the way it would go in real life, it would have been like 1 page. And it would have been like, do you want me to just like show you my Tinder profile and that will kind of explain everything to you? If this was a real conversation, I don't think Theo would have explained that much. It would have been like 3 days later when they're 4 drinks in, Theo would have really opened up about it. But it's a book, and like a lot of cis people are going to read it, and a lot of people who don't know any non-binary people or don't even know if they exist read it. And while I am writing for the people who can relate to Theo's experience, I think I'm also aware that this is a book that's going to be sold in Walmart and Target, you know, and I did intentionally bury the lead of one of the love interests being somebody who uses they them pronouns because I knew that a lot of readers would not get past page 1 if they saw they them pronouns, and I wanted them to not have the chance to reject Theo off the bat. I wanted them to come to love Theo before they had a chance to reject them on those grounds.
Yeah.
And I also think, yes, gender in the public eye is very much a part of Theo's story. The way that they wish they had more freedom to just have this be a thing that's a personal thing. Instead, it has to be a thing that is complicated in the way that it is part of their public self. You know, I think the level of openness I have about gender and sexuality has ultimately been good for my mental health, but has been really difficult and painful to reach that point.
Casey, I know you have a completely stacked day of things to do after this interview, and so you've been so generous with your time. I want to ask quickly before you go, as we've said a couple times during this conversation, queer romance and the landscape of book publishing and the political scene in North America, all of these things have changed so much in the time that you've been writing and publishing. What's your hope for the future of queer romance as a genre looking ahead?
I mean, I hope that, first of all, that it continues to flourish and diversify. I've seen a really marked increase in traditional publishing giving voice to trans masculine authors, and by a marked increase I mean like 5 as opposed to 0 per year. But I really feel like we're still way behind on like trans feminine authors. I would love to see more trans femme voices in romance. I would love to see people who are not white in queer romance. I would love to see like an overflowing shelf of really great writing, and that its main marketing is not simply that it is gay or whatever, but that it's also really good. I would love to see every single possible book ban in the United States be struck down, and I would love to see queer authors be part of the charge to do that. My publisher, Macmillan, is part of a group of the big 5 publishers in the U.S. who are currently suing Florida to try and put an end to book banning. I want to see publishers take a really strong stand against that, and I'm really heartened by like the court cases that are happening now, and I hope that that continues. There's so much progress, and I feel so excited about, and I really can't wait to see what's next for this genre. And I think romance is a really amazing fertile ground for queer stories to continue to be told and told well.
Well, you have managed to make me excited about the future of the romance novel and also so excited to see what sort of work you do next. Casey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.
What you just heard was my conversation with Casey McQuiston. I could have kept talking with Casey for hours, and I really hope we'll get the chance to chat again soon. This episode was produced by our executive producer, Aaron Balser, and Katie Swales. Our senior producer is Jacqueline Kirk. I also want to thank our radio techs and the entire CBC Books team. It takes a village to make a show. I'm Mattea Roach, and this is Bookends. You can tune in on Sundays and Wednesdays on CBC Radio or follow the show on the podcast app of your choice. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Because when the book ends, the conversation begins.